What if one quiet act of courage could ignite a revolution? In a world where silence once shielded injustice, one woman's stand against humiliation sparked a movement no one could ignore. From the cold walls of a jail cell to the heart of a city hungry for change, discover the story of Amira Lewis, story of dignity, resilience, and the unstoppable power of standing tall when the world demands you bow. Stay with us. This is more than a fight for justice. It's a blueprint for hope. If you think the darkest battles happen under the spotlight, you're wrong. The most devastating ones start quietly, under the soft hum of fluorescent lights, when nobody is supposed to be watching. On a muggy spring night in Jacksonville, Florida, Amira Lewis just wanted to go home. After 14 relentless hours working the emergency room at St. Vincent's Hospital, her body ached in ways she didn't even bother cataloging anymore. Her hands trembled slightly from exhaustion as she turned the key in her aging Buick, the headlights casting long shadows across an almost empty strip mall. The pharmacy was still open barely. Its sickly neon sign flickered like a dying heartbeat against the thick Florida air. Amira pulled into a parking spot under a faulty street lamp, killed the engine, and sat there for a moment, breathing, in and out. A simple errand, she thought. Pick up her blood pressure medication, go home, sleep. Nothing more, nothing complicated. She grabbed her purse and stepped into the oppressive heat, her sneakers scuffing the cracked asphalt. She moved with the measured grace of someone who had spent a lifetime pushing through pain without complaint. Inside the pharmacy, the air was sharp with the smell of antiseptic. The teenage clerk at the counter didn't even bother to hide his boredom, barely glancing up as Amira approached and offered her the briefest flicker of acknowledgement. Amira, ever patient, slid her ID, insurance card, and prescription across the counter with a soft smile. Routine. Familiar. Safe. Or so she thought. Minutes dragged on longer than they should have. The boy frowned at the screen. Then he leaned over and muttered something to the store manager, a tight-lipped woman who wore disapproval like perfume. One glance at Amira, another at the screen, and the woman's face hardened. She whispered something back, tapping urgently at the keyboard. Amira shifted slightly. She recognized the shift in the air, the sudden crackle of suspicion that no words ever needed to announce. She had lived with it her whole life, that silent, slithering judgment that crawled into a room before anyone even opened their mouth. Finally, the manager approached the counter with a brittle smile. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said, her voice sticky sweet. "There seems to be a problem with your prescription." Amira kept her voice level. "Problem? I've been filling this same medication here for years." The manager fidgeted. "The account information. It's not matching up." She took a step back, her hands wringing nervously. "We've contacted the authorities. They'll sort it out." The authorities. The word hit Amira like a slap. She blinked once, slowly, willing herself to stay calm. She could have turned and walked out, demanded her paperwork back, but she knew how that would look. She knew the game they were playing. And tonight, she wasn't going to play it. Minutes later, the jarring chirp of the automatic door shattered the stale quiet. 2 police officers entered, both white, both carrying the heavy casualness of men who thought they owned every room they walked into. The manager rushed to meet them, her voice dropping into a stage whisper thick with self-righteousness. "That's her," she hissed. "Tried to use fraudulent insurance." Neither officer asked to see her ID. Neither asked for clarification. They moved toward Amira with slow, predatory certainty. "Ma'am," the larger officer said, his voice dripping with contempt. "I'm going to need you to step outside." Amira stood tall, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it behind her eyes. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, her voice steady, daring them to listen. But they weren't here to listen. One officer's hand drifted toward his belt. The other customer in the store started recording discreetly with his phone. "Good," Amira thought grimly. "Let the world see." She held up her documents carefully. "I have my ID. My prescription. Everything you need to clear this up." The officer didn't even look. "Step outside now." When she didn't move fast enough, he grabbed her wrist roughly. A sharp gasp rose from somewhere in the aisles. Amira didn't resist. Resistance was exactly what they wanted. Instead, she let them lead her out, her back straight, her chin high, her dignity intact even as the cold bite of handcuffs locked around her wrists. As the squad car swallowed her whole, the heavy door slamming shut with brutal finality, Amira met the officer's gaze without flinching. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," she said quietly, the words sinking deep, anchoring themselves into the night. He scoffed, turned away, confident he had won. He had no idea. Tonight wasn't just another arrest. It was the start of a reckoning he couldn't outrun it. Amira Lewis was about to show him exactly what strength looked like when the world refused to see it. But the tragedy wasn't over yet. In fact, it was only just beginning. The squad car rattled as it bumped over the cracked pavement, every jolt sending a fresh spike of pain through Amira's cuffed wrists. She sat stiffly in the back seat, her breathing measured, her eyes locked on the dim city lights flashing past the window. Every instinct screamed at her to shout, to fight back, to demand that they see her humanity. But she knew better. Survival, especially for a black woman in a pair of handcuffs, demanded something far more dangerous than anger. It demanded patience. In the front seats, the two officers spoke in low, casual voices, as if discussing nothing more consequential than a ballgame. Their laughter, lazy and sharp, sliced through the stale air inside the car. "Another one trying to play the system," said the older one, the broad-shouldered officer who had first grabbed her. Officer Brandon Whitaker, if she had caught the badge right. The younger one, Officer Kyle Monroe, shifted uncomfortably but offered no disagreement. "Yeah," he muttered. "Another one." Amira squeezed her hands into fists against the cold bite of the metal cuffs. They didn't know her. They didn't care. She was just another box to check on a night's work, another statistic filed under suspected fraud before they grabbed coffee and laughed about it over donuts. The station came into view, an aging concrete block with peeling paint and a sagging roofline that looked as tired as the city itself. The fluorescent lights inside buzzed weakly, and the cracked sign out front read Jacksonville Police Substation Number 9, its letters partially burned out. Whitaker yanked open the squad car door with an impatient jerk. "Let's go," he barked, gripping Amira's arm tighter than necessary as he pulled her out. She stumbled slightly but caught herself before hitting the ground. Even now, even humiliated, she refused to let them see her fall. Inside, the smell of old coffee and disinfectant hit her like a wall. Officers lounged behind desks cluttered with paperwork and half-eaten sandwiches, barely glancing up as Whitaker and Monroe led Amira through the station like a trophy. Conversation stopped, then restarted in hushed, amused tones. They led her to the booking desk, where a heavy-set desk sergeant with a mustard stain on his uniform raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Whitaker dropped a crumpled intake form in front of him. "Prescription fraud," he said loudly enough for half the station to hear. "Caught her trying to scam the system." The sergeant smirked. "Of course," he muttered, not even trying to hide the disgust curling his lip. Amira stood silently as they fingerprinted her, the ink cold and sticky against her skin, then took her mugshot flash. Click. Another little piece of her dignity stolen and stored away. She kept her face calm, her shoulders square. They would not break her, not here. The metal cuffs were finally removed, only to be replaced with another humiliation. A bare, cold-holding cell with a dented bench and bars that smelled of rust and despair. Whitaker shoved her inside with a sneer. "Welcome to your new home," he said, before slamming the door shut with a metallic clang that echoed down the hallway. Amira sat on the bench, hands folded carefully in her lap. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to breathe slowly, deeply. She had been through worse. She had survived worse. She would survive this. Minutes dragged into an hour, the flickering overhead light throwing her shadow jaggedly across the walls. She listened to the low murmur of voices from the main station. Occasionally, laughter would bubble up, sharp and cruel. She caught fragments. Another one, playing the victim, won't hold up in court each word chipping away at the veneer of professionalism they wore like ill-fitting armor. The humiliation was deep and cutting, but beneath it, something else stirred a slow, cold anger. A resolve forged in every instance she had been overlooked, underestimated, discarded. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Not yet. Suddenly, the low hum of conversation outside shifted, tightening into something tense, brittle. The heavy metal door at the front of the station creaked open, and a new presence filled the air, dense and undeniable. Footsteps echoed, slow and deliberate. Officers who had been slouched, lazily straightened, without realizing it. The temperature of the room seemed to drop. Amira didn't move. She didn't have to. She already knew. Major Lewis, her father, had arrived. There was no mistaking his presence. Even retired, even with a slight stoop to his back from years of carrying the weight of justice on his shoulders, he commanded attention like a general surveying a battlefield. Behind him came two men in dark suits. Earpieces tucked discreetly into their ears, the unmistakable mark of federal agents. The desk sergeant blanched visibly. Whitaker, standing near the coffee machine, straightened like a puppet, yanked upright on invisible strings. Monroe froze mid-sip, his coffee cup trembling slightly in his hand. Major Lewis's voice cut through the heavy air like a blade. "Who's the ranking officer on duty?" The desk sergeant stumbled forward, his words tumbling over each other. That would be me, sir." Major Lewis didn't blink. "Good. Then you'll explain to me why my daughter, a licensed healthcare professional with no criminal record, is sitting behind bars tonight." The room went so silent that the buzzing overhead lights sounded deafening. Whitaker opened his mouth to speak, but a sharp glance from one of the agents silenced him. Monroe looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. "I expect all documentation, all body cam footage, and every report generated tonight to be made available immediately," Major Lewis continued, his voice calm but carrying the kind of authority that made excuses dry up in men's throats. The sergeant stammered in acknowledgement, fumbling with keys, papers, anything to avoid meeting Major Lewis's gaze. Through it all, Amira sat perfectly still, her chin lifted, her eyes locked on the bars. She didn't smile, she didn't gloat, she simply waited. The key turned in the lock with a slow, grinding click. The cell door creaked open. Major Lewis stepped aside, allowing one of the agents to hold the door. Amira stood slowly, every muscle stiff from hours on the metal bench. She walked out with measured grace, her back straight, her head high. As she passed Whitaker, she caught his eye sand. In that instant, she saw it. Fear. Real, naked fear. Because now, he understood. This wasn't going away. This wasn't being swept under the rug. And he, along with everyone else who thought they could treat her like less than human, was about to face the consequences. Amira walked past them all without a word, stepping into the thick Florida night, where the real battle was only just beginning. But humiliation wasn't finished with her yet. It had only just begun sharpening its knives. The moment Amira stepped out of the station, the night air slapped her face, thick and heavy, tasting of rain and asphalt. Her wrists still bore the raw imprint of the metal cuffs, a silent testimony to the indignity she had endured. Yet even then, she walked steadily, refusing to crumble under the weight of what they had tried to make her feel. She wasn't alone. Not tonight. Yet back at the pharmacy, just hours before this rescue, the scene had played out much differently, uglier, sharper, soaked with the casual cruelty that came not from rage, but from indifference. It had started with that false sweetness from the manager, the brittle smile hiding a blade. It had escalated with the phone call, the code words spoken too easily, suspicious, insurance fraud, possible criminal activity. And when the officers stormed through the glass doors, they didn't come looking for answers. They came looking for someone to blame. The first officer through the door was a slab of muscle and authority, his uniform hanging stiffly on broad shoulders, his buzz-cut hair doing little to soften the aggression radiating from every pore. His partner was leaner, younger, with a nervous twitch at the corner of his mouth, like he already knew things would get messy but didn't have the spine to stop it. They barely glanced at the manager's trembling finger pointing at Amira. They didn't look at the paperwork she had neatly laid out. They didn't ask questions. They didn't listen. They saw a tired black woman standing alone under flickering lights and decided they didn't need any other evidence. "Ma'am, step away from the counter," the lead officer barked, hand already moving toward his belt. Amira, steady and professional even in her exhaustion, spoke calmly. "Officers, there must be a mistake. I have all my identification right here. Please look." She raised her hand slightly, palms open, the universal gesture of peace. But peace was the last thing they were interested in. The younger officer, Monroe, shifted, uncertainty flashing across his face. For a heartbeat, a choice hung in the air, a chance for decency to take root. But Whitaker was already moving. Without warning, without a word, he lunged forward, grabbing Amira's wrist in a brutal grip. Gasps echoed through the pharmacy. A mother grabbed her child and pulled him close. An elderly man near the vitamin aisle fumbled for his phone, fingers shaking as he hit record. "You're under investigation for attempted prescription fraud," Whitaker growled, twisting Amira's arm behind her back. "I'm not resisting," Amira said firmly, her voice carrying through the heavy silence. "Please, you're hurting me." But Whitaker wasn't interested in restraint. His handcuffs snapped around her wrists with a vicious finality, the metal biting deep into her skin. Monroe flinched but said nothing, his eyes darting anxiously toward the gathering crowd. Phones were out now, recording every humiliating second. Still, no one intervened. Still, Amira didn't fight. To resist would be to give them permission to escalate. To survive, she had to stay still, stay calm, stay dignified even as her humanity was being stripped away one brutal gesture at a time. Whitaker shoved her toward the door, barking orders she didn't need keep moving. Don't resist. Cooperatias, if she were some violent criminal rather than a nurse coming off a 14-hour shift who had committed no crime except daring to exist in her own skin. Outside, the humid night wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket. Red and blue lights strobed across the cracked pavement, making her feel exposed, painted in guilt for a crime she didn't commit. They forced her against the squad car, her cheek scraping the cool metal as Whitaker searched her roughly, his hands moving with careless cruelty. Every movement was a message. You don't belong. You're not safe. You are powerless here. And Amira, despite every fiber of her body screaming in protest, held on to her dignity like a shield. "I'm a nurse," she said, her voice low but steady. "I have no criminal record. I have my ID and prescription. You're making a mistake." Whitaker chuckled darkly. "They all say that." The back door of the squad car yawned open, a steel mouth ready to swallow her whole. As they shoved her inside, Amira caught one last glimpse of the crowd gathering at the edge of the parking lot, strangers holding up phones, their faces a mixture of horror and resignation. She locked eyes with one woman, a young mother clutching her toddler, her mouth pressed into a thin, trembling line. Amira didn't know her, but she knew that look. She had worn it herself, once, watching news reports of others unjustly treated, wondering when, not if, her turn would come. The door slammed shut, sealing her inside. The ride to the station was a blur of flashing lights and muffled radio chatter. Whitaker and Monroe didn't speak to her. She didn't speak to them. The silence was thick, poisonous, thrumming with things left unsaid. Amira leaned her head against the window, the glass cool against her burning skin. She watched the city slip past the empty bus stops, the darkened storefronts, the flicker of life in the houses where families gathered around televisions, safe, unbothered. She wondered if any of them would ever see her, truly see her, not just as another headline, another viral video, another cautionary tale. She wondered if she would make it home at all. When they pulled into the station, the humiliation continued like a slow, grinding machine. Officers stared as she was marched through the booking area. A few snickered. Others didn't bother hiding their smirks. The desk sergeant barely glanced up as Whitaker announced her alleged crime. "Fraud," he said loudly, his voice dripping with contempt. "Black woman, prescription scam." The words hung in the air like smoke, staining everything they touched. They processed her like a criminal photograph, fingerprints, the whole humiliating ritual designed to strip away every last shred of dignity. When it was over, they shoved her into a holding cell with a dented metal bench and bars so rusted they looked ready to crumble. The door slammed shut behind her with a sound that echoed in her bones. Amira sat down slowly, her back straight, her hands resting in her lap. She had done nothing wrong. She was innocent. But tonight, innocence wasn't protection. It was a dare. And in the silent, stifling dark, as the fluorescent lights flickered overhead and the sounds of casual cruelty drifted down the hallway, Amira made herself a promise. They would not break her. They could strip away her comfort, her peace, her safety, but they would not take her dignity. Not tonight. Not ever. But the silence inside that jail was heavier than any noise that had come before. As the metal door slammed shut behind her, sealing her into the holding cell, Amira Lewis sat perfectly still on the cold dented bench, her back ramrod straight, her hands resting loosely in her lap. Around her, the old station hummed with life phones rang. Boots clattered against linoleum. Laughter echoed from unseen rooms but inside the cell. It was as if the world had collapsed into an endless, suffocating quiet. Her wrists still throbbed from the brutal tightness of the handcuffs. The red, angry welts burned against her skin, a raw reminder of how easily human dignity could be discarded when power went unchecked. She focused on her breathing. In, out, slow and even. A discipline she had learned not just in medical school but in life itself. Because in a world that judged you by the color of your skin before you even spoke, composure wasn't a courtesy, it was armor. Outside the bars, officers passed by without looking at her. Some whispered to each other, throwing occasional glances her way. Faces twisted in smirks they didn't bother hiding. Others ignored her completely, as if acknowledging her existence would somehow taint them. The desk sergeant, the one with the mustard stain on his uniform, leaned back in his chair and called out loudly enough for everyone to hear, "What's the holdup on the fraud case? She confess yet?" Laughter rippled through the room. Amira kept her gaze forward, staring at the scuffed wall in front of her. She refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. They wanted anger. They wanted outrage. They wanted her to play into the caricature they already believed about her. She would give them nothing. Minutes dragged into hours. The overhead fluorescent light buzzed, throwing sharp, unflattering shadows across the floor. The air inside the cell was stale and too warm, thick with the sour stench of old sweat and disinfectant. Time twisted itself into strange shapes. 5 minutes felt like 50, an hour felt like an entire night. From somewhere in the station, a radio crackled to life, the tinny sound of a dispatcher's voice rattling off codes and addresses. An officer answered with a bored grunt, then laughed at some private joke. More footsteps, more glances, more whispers. One younger officer, barely more than a boy, stopped outside Amira's cell at one point. He looked at her, really looked, his face uncertain, uncomfortable. For a fleeting second, Amira thought he might say something, might do something. But then Whitaker's heavy boots thudded into view, and the boy flinched like a dog expecting a blow. He muttered something under his breath and hurried away. Whitaker smirked as he leaned casually against the bars, arms crossed, one boot scuffing lazily against the floor. "You know," he drawled, "you made this a lot harder on yourself than it needed to be." Amira didn't respond. He tilted his head, studying her like she was some interesting insect pinned under glass. "Could have just admitted what you were doing. Could have walked out with just a warning." Still, she said nothing. The smirk widened. But no, had to get all uppity, had to make a scene. Across the room, Monroe sat stiffly at a desk, studiously avoiding looking at either of them. His hands fidgeted restlessly, tapping a staccato rhythm on the battered wood surface. Whitaker chuckled. "They'll probably cut you loose in the morning. Maybe, maybe not. Depends on how busy we get tonight. Sometimes we forget people down here." Another officer laughed from somewhere deeper in the station. Amira kept her breathing slow, her expression carefully neutral. Every second she stayed silent, she was denying them power. Every second she remained composed, she was winning a battle they didn't even realize they had started. But inside, the pressure built like steam inside a sealed pipe. Every slight, every cruel chuckle, every assumption about who she was and what she deserved, they stacked atop one another, brick by bitter brick. She thought about the patients she had cared for that day, the lives she had touched, the grief she had helped families carry. None of it mattered here. None of it mattered to men like Whitaker, who saw her only through a narrow, poisoned lens. Hours passed. The night deepened, the station growing quieter, as the city outside settled into uneasy slumber. The fluorescent light overhead flickered again, buzzing loudly for a moment before settling back into its angry hum. The clock on the wall ticked louder with each passing minute, carving deep grooves into the silence. Tick. Tock. Tick. Tock. Amira's neck ached from holding her head high. Her lower back screamed from the cold hardness of the bench. Her hands, though now free of cuffs, curled into fists against the injustice of it all. But she would not cry. She would not beg. She would not give them that. Somewhere far away, maybe in another part of the city, someone was finishing dinner. Someone was putting their children to bed. Someone was brushing their teeth and setting alarms and sliding into warm, safe beds. Amira sat alone in a concrete box, treated like a criminal for no reason, but the color of her skin and the laziness of men who couldn't be bothered to see her humanity. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the darkness behind her lids wash over her. Not break her. It would build her. Because the thing about pressure, the thing about relentless, grinding injustices, that it didn't just crush. Sometimes it forged something harder, something sharper, something unstoppable. Somewhere beyond the walls of that dingy police station, the first ripples of change were already stirring. A call had been made. A name had been spoken. And men like Whitaker, so smug in their little fortress of unchecked power, were about to discover that the storm they had so carelessly summoned was far bigger than anything they had ever faced. But for now, for these long, brutal hours, Amira sat in silence, her body aching, her soul burning, her spirit sharpening itself against the stone of their cruelty, waiting, enduring, becoming. Just when it seemed the night couldn't get any heavier, it did. The clock on the wall had just ticked past 2 a.m. when the front doors of the station banged open with a force that silenced every voice, mid-laughter, mid-whisper, mid-breath. Amira, still sitting quietly on the cold bench, barely lifted her head, but she felt the shift like a thunderclap rolling through the building. Something massive had entered, something inevitable. Major Lewis had arrived. He didn't come alone. Behind him moved 2 federal agents, their dark suits crisp, their movements sharp and efficient. Earpieces glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights. Their presence wasn't just noticed, it slammed into the consciousness of everyone in the room, with the unmistakable authority of the federal government making itself known. The desk sergeant froze with one hand halfway to a coffee cup. Officers who had lounged lazily moments before scrambled to straighten up, instinctively recognizing that whatever this was, it wasn't routine. Major Lewis moved like a man who had spent his life dismantling systems built on arrogance and corruption. His step was steady, unhurried, his face carved from stone. His eyes, sharp and unrelenting, swept across the room once and found his target. Sergeant Boyd, caught mid-bluster, blinked and stammered, "Can I help you, sir?" Major Lewis stopped a few feet from the desk. He didn't need to raise his voice. Authority hung on him like an invisible mantle. "You already have," he said quietly. "You made a very big mistake tonight." The entire station seemed to hold its breath. Whitaker, standing near the corner, stiffened, his jaw tightening. Monroe paled visibly, his hand trembling as he set down a clipboard. The lead agent beside Major Lewis stepped forward, holding up a sleek black badge wallet. "Federal Civil Rights Division," he announced. "Effective immediately. We are placing this station under review, pending investigation into multiple alleged violations of constitutional rights." The sergeant's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. Whitaker stepped forward, puffing up his chest. "You can't just barge in here," he barked, trying to summon the bluster he wore so easily when facing the powerless. Major Lewis turned his gaze on him, a slow, measured pivot that seemed to peel Whitaker's defenses back layer by layer. "I already did," Lewis said. Behind him, one of the agents moved to the nearest terminal, plugging in a device that began copying files with cold efficiency. Another agent headed toward the evidence room, clipboard in hand. Chaos rippled through the room. Officers whispered frantically. Phones buzzed against desks. Someone swore under their breath. In the holding cell, Amira finally allowed herself a breath. She didn't smile, not yet, but the knot in her chest loosened just a fraction. Major Lewis didn't move to the cell immediately. He let the silence stretch. Let the weight of what was happening settle over every man and woman in uniform. Finally, he spoke again, his voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "I want my daughter released immediately. Without charges. Without conditions. And I want every piece of paperwork related to her detention turned over for federal review." Sergeant Boyd licked his lips, glancing at Whitaker for guidance. Whitaker, stubborn to the last, sneered. Maybe she should have thought of that before committing fraud. The words had barely left his mouth before the second federal agent, a tall woman with a tight bun and eyes like broken glass, stepped forward. "You will refrain from speaking another word without counsel," she said sharply. "Or you will add obstruction of justice to the list of charges you're already facing." Whitaker's mouth snapped shut with an audible click. The agent turned to the sergeant. "Open the cell, now." Keys jangled in a clumsy hand. Boyd nearly dropped them in his haste, but finally found the right one. The heavy lock clicked, and the door creaked open. Amira rose slowly. Every muscle ached, every fiber of her being screamed from the injustice she had been forced to endure. But she stood tall, her chin high, her dignity untarnished. Major Lewis stepped aside, offering his hand, but Amira shook her head gently. She would walk out under her own power. She stepped through the threshold and out into the center of the station, where officers stood frozen, eyes wide, some in shame, some in fear. Major Lewis turned to Whitaker, his voice low but lethal. "You had every chance to treat her with respect. You chose humiliation. You chose violence. Now you'll answer for it." Whitaker's face twisted in a mixture of fury and panic, but he said nothing. One of the federal agents moved to Amira's side. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "we're ready to escort you." Amira nodded once. They moved together through the station, a small procession of dignity, slicing through the wreckage of arrogance and corruption. Officers parted before them like grass before a storm. No jeers now, no laughter. Only silence and the distant buzz of printers frantically spitting out subpoenaed documents. At the front doors, Amira paused. She turned, sweeping her gaze over the room. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't triumphant. She was bearing witness. She was making sure every single person there understood that this night their night was over. She stepped out into the humid Florida air, feeling it wrap around her like a balm, like a homecoming. Major Lewis followed a step behind, his presence steady and unshakable. The parking lot, once empty, was now crowded. News vans with satellite dishes, protesters with handmade signs, bystanders who had seen the video footage shared online and had come to bear witness. A cheer went up the moment they emerged. Reporters surged forward, microphones thrust out, questions tumbling over each other. "Miss Lewis, what happened inside? Are you filing charges? Is the DOJ involved?" Amira didn't answer. Not yet. There would be time for words. Right now, there was only this moment. Major Lewis leaned in slightly. "This is bigger than you now," he murmured. Amira nodded slowly. She understood. It wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, humiliated, erased. She squared her shoulders, lifted her head high, and walked forward into the crowd, into the cameras, into the storm that was coming. And for the first time that night, she wasn't just enduring. She was leading. The reckoning had begun, but the real storm hadn't even started yet. Stepping into the thick, humid Florida night, Amira barely had time to register the crowd swelling before her. Cameras flashed like lightning strikes. Voices tumbled over each other in a chaotic rush, and the heavy buzz of energy in the air was almost tangible. Major Lewis moved like a man with a mission, calm but unstoppable, guiding Amira through the crowd with a hand that never once left her shoulder. The reporters screamed questions. Protesters cheered. Some simply stood in stunned silence, recording every second on trembling phones. Inside the station, the silence Amira left behind fractured into something else entirely. Major Lewis wasn't finished. He turned, standing at the top of the precinct steps like a general surveying a battlefield, and raised his voice just enough to be heard over the roar outside. "This station," he announced, "is now under federal review, pending investigation into civil rights violations." His words didn't just hang in the air. They detonated, rippling through every officer still lingering inside. Sergeant Boyd visibly blanched. Monroe sat frozen at his desk, pale and sweating. Whitaker, standing stiff as a board near the rear exit, looked ready to bolt but stayed rooted, pinned by the full force of the disaster barreling toward him. Major Lewis pointed directly at Boyd. "You will release all body cam footage immediately. You will provide every internal report. Every piece of evidence. No edits, no gaps. No excuses." The female federal agent beside him stepped forward, producing a thick sheaf of official-looking documents. "We have signed subpoenas for all departmental records," she added crisply. "Compliance is not optional." Inside the command center, hastily established in a commandeered conference room 2 blocks away, federal agents were already setting up. Banks of monitors flickered to life, displaying live security feeds, uploading case files, cross-referencing years of complaints filed against the Jacksonville Police Department. It was not a raid. It was an occupation. Cold. Methodical. Unstoppable. Back at the precinct, the realization hit the officers like a hammer blow. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. This wasn't going to quietly go away once the cameras turned off. This was real. And it was just beginning. Whitaker tried once more to assert control, stepping toward Major Lewis with a sneer curling his lip. "You people always blow things out of proportion," he said loudly enough for the reporters outside to catch every word. The federal agent at Lewis's side moved in instantly. "Officer Whitaker," she said sharply, "you are hereby suspended pending a full investigation, effective immediately. Please surrender your badge and firearm." Whitaker's face turned a mottled red, but he saw the cameras, saw the crowd, saw the agents tightening their formation around him. Slowly, like a man drowning and trying to delay the inevitable, he unpinned his badge and placed it on the desk with a loud clatter. His gun followed seconds later, set down with enough force that it rattled the coffee cups nearby. Inside and outside, the atmosphere shifted again, electrifying, sharpening. It wasn't fear, no, it was accountability, roaring down the hallways like a flood breaking a dam. And Major Lewis wasn't done yet. He turned to the federal agents. "Initiate full departmental audit. Start with the use of force reports. I want every case cross-referenced with the officer's disciplinary history, no exceptions. Already in progress," one agent confirmed, tapping rapidly on a government-issued tablet. Data poured onto the screens, a flood of dates, names, complaints. Incidents buried in paperwork, in silence, in complicity, now dragged into the light, kicking and screaming. Amira stood a few steps behind her father, watching it all unfold. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't vengeful. What she felt was something deeper, something colder, justice taking its first breath after being suffocated for too long. In the crowd, chants began to rise. Justice for Amira. End police abuse. The news anchors, hastily assembled, began broadcasting live, their voices urgent, breathless. The story was no longer local. It was national now. Savannah to Atlanta to New York to Los Angeles screens all over the country flickered to images of the Jacksonville station under siege, of a black woman standing tall, flanked by federal agents, refusing to be erased. Major Lewis turned once more toward the precinct, his voice quieter now but no less deadly. "Understand this," he said to no one and everyone at once. "This isn't about one woman. This isn't about one night. This is about a pattern, a sickness. And starting tonight, we're going to cut it out root and branch." Inside the precinct, officers scattered like leaves in a hurricane. Some hurriedly packed up paperwork. Some stared at their boots. A few slipped quietly out the back door, but it was too late. Their names were already logged, their histories already under review. There was nowhere left to hide. By the time Amira and Major Lewis reached the hastily set-up podium in the parking lot, the crowd had doubled. Television networks rolled live coverage. Protesters waved signs high in the air. Somewhere, someone began playing Sam Cooke's "A Change Is Gonna Come" softly through a portable speaker, the soulful strains threading through the humid night. Major Lewis stepped back, letting Amira take the microphone first. She gripped it tightly, her hands steady, even though her heart thundered in her chest. "I didn't ask for this fight," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the parking lot. "I didn't want to become a symbol. But tonight is not just about me. It's about every voice that has been silenced, every life that has been dismissed, every time someone said, 'Nothing will change.'" She paused, letting the weight of her words settle into the crowd, into the cameras, into every watching heart across America. "Something changed tonight," she said, "and we are not going back." The crowd erupted into cheers. The federal agents behind her stood straighter. Major Lewis allowed himself the smallest, proudest of smiles. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. As the chants rose higher into the night air, Amira turned to her father. For once, the weight she carried felt a little lighter, a little more shared. Major Lewis nodded at her. A silent message only she could hear: "You are not alone." And inside that station, buried under subpoenas, interviews, and the relentless force of truth, the old order began to crumble. One brick at a time, one lie at a time. Until soon, there would be nowhere left for injustice to hide. The storm was here, and it wasn't leaving. But just when it seemed like the storm might subside for a moment, the streets answered back with a roar no one could ignore. In the hours following Amira's release and Major Lewis's searing speech, Jacksonville transformed from a sleeping southern city into the pulsing heart of a national movement. What started with a single moment of injustice, a single woman standing silent and strong behind a set of rusted holding cell bars, had ignited something deeper, something long buried, beneath years of quiet suffering and polite resignation. The first signs came quietly. Candlelight vigils outside the station, makeshift posters with Amira's face held high above the crowd, slogans hastily scrawled in permanent marker: "Justice for Amira," "Dignity is not a crime," "End systemic abuse." News vans that had once come for a soundbite now camped outside permanently, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical sunflowers. Reporters scrambled for angles. But the real story wasn't being spun inside newsrooms, it was unfolding in the streets. By noon the next day, the protests spread beyond the precinct to City Hall. Thousands gathered, not just activists or seasoned protesters, but ordinary people, teachers, nurses, veterans, students, church elders. They carried signs, they sang old freedom songs, they demanded action not in anger alone but in a deep, righteous insistence that this time, things would not be allowed to return to normal. Amira watched it unfold from the sidelines at first. She stayed at a small safe house provided by a civil rights group, avoiding the chaos but feeling every vibration of it through her bones. Major Lewis checked in often but gave her space, understanding that healing from what had happened wasn't a straight line. She spent hours sitting by the window, watching the live coverage, thousands chanting her name, holding candles for her dignity, marching for her humanity. Jacksonville's mayor, caught between the growing tide of national scrutiny and the crumbling walls of local power, held a hastily arranged press conference. He stood stiffly behind the podium, sweat glistening on his forehead, as he offered promises of reform and community review boards. But it was too little, too late. The people weren't asking anymore. They were demanding. As the afternoon wore on, more national voices joined. Civil rights leaders flew in from across the country. Celebrities posted videos calling for justice. Hashtags trended worldwide. Number, Justice for Amira. Number, Stand with Amira. Number, End the Cycle. What had begun as one station's shame was now the nation's reckoning. Marches sprang up across the city, coordinated like an unstoppable river, finding every low point and flooding it. Downtown businesses, some fearful at first, put signs in their windows supporting the movement. Local unions called for solidarity strikes. Churches opened their doors for organizing meetings and prayer vigils. And it wasn't just Jacksonville. Across Florida, then across the South, protests erupted in sympathy and outrage. Miami, Tallahassee, Orlando, then Atlanta, Houston, Charlotte. The images flooded social media, seas of faces, arms locked together, voices raised not in hate but in unyielding demand. At the center of it all, whether she liked it or not, was Amira. On the third night, after much persuasion from Major Lewis and the growing leadership of the movement, Amira agreed to speak publicly. She stepped onto a makeshift stage built from a flatbed truck in the heart of Hemming Plaza, the historic square now packed wall to wall with people. The crowd was a living thing, breathing, shifting, waiting. She stood in front of the microphone, the lights from 1,000 phones pointed at her like stars drawn down to earth. She wore simple jeans and a plain black shirt, no slogans, no flashy colors, just her truth, standing in the open. When she spoke, her voice was not polished, not theatrical. It cracked in places. It stumbled once or twice. But it was real. And because it was real, it was unstoppable. "I am not here tonight because I am special," she began, the sound system carrying her words across the packed plaza. "I am here because what happened to me happens to people every day in this country. The only difference is that this time, somebody was watching. This time, somebody cared." She paused, letting that truth settle into every heart present. "I am not just fighting for myself. I am standing for every person who has been dragged from a store, from a car, from a sidewalk, from their own home because someone decided they didn't look like they belonged. I am standing for every tired mother who was treated like a criminal. For every son whose life was ended before it even began. For every father who had to tell his children how to survive an encounter that should never have been dangerous." The crowd was silent, hanging on every syllable. They told me to stay silent. They told me to be grateful if they let me go quietly. But silence has never protected us. Silence has only allowed injustice to grow. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. Today, we break that silence. The roar that erupted in response was deafening. It wasn't just noise. It was agreement. It was pain given voice. It was hope set loose. After she finished speaking, Amira didn't rush off stage. She stood there, shoulders squared, as the crowd surged forward, not to swarm her, not to trap her, but to lift her up. Strangers reached out not to take selfies, not to clamor for attention, but to touch her hand, her shoulder, her sleeve, as if gathering strength from her presence. That night, the protests didn't end at sunset like so many others had. They grew louder, more determined, but still peaceful. Organizers distributed water, snacks, medical kits. Lawyers handed out cards with hotline numbers. Volunteers directed traffic to protect marchers. The city's leadership, overwhelmed and exposed, began to fracture. Two senior officers from the Jacksonville PD resigned under pressure. Their disciplinary histories leaked to the press. A local councilwoman publicly called for a full independent audit of the police department. The governor of Florida, seeing the media firestorm brewing, announced the formation of a state-level commission on policing reforms. It was a tidal shift, undeniable and irreversible. Amira spent that night not in a safe house, but among her people marching slowly down the lit streets, hand in hand with grandmothers, teenagers, pastors, construction workers, nurses. No special bodyguards, no VIP section, just another marcher, another voice in a movement that had become too big for anyone to stop. She didn't have to shout slogans, she didn't have to raise her fist. Her presence alone was a rallying cry. As the march wound its way past the darkened city buildings, someone began to sing. First one voice, thin and trembling, then another and another, until the entire river of people swelled into song. We shall overcome. Old words, new power. Amira sang too, her voice, blending into the chorus, carried forward on a wave of determination that had started with her suffering but would not end there. Because this wasn't just about justice for Amira anymore. It was about justice, period. And for the first time in a long, long time, justice didn't feel like a dream. It felt like it was finally coming home. But just when it seemed that the flame of justice had burned bright enough, something even more powerful ignited. In the days following the marches, the speeches, and the swelling crowds, a new front opened in the battle for accountability. It wasn't fought with chants or signs this time. It was fought with signatures, sworn affidavits, and the cold, methodical machinery of the law. It started with a meeting. Small at first, quiet. In the basement of an old church, 2 blocks from Hemming Plaza, organizers gathered those who had real stories, raw stories about encounters with the Jacksonville Police Department that had been swept aside for years. Amira was there, sitting in the front row, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her presence steady and electrifying. She didn't speak at first. She listened. One by one, the victims stood up. A young man whose teeth were shattered by a baton during a traffic stop. A middle-aged woman slammed to the pavement during a mistaken identity arrest. An elderly veteran handcuffed at gunpoint because of a clerical error in the system. Their voices were tired but determined. Their pain still fresh, but their courage stronger than fear. Attorney Marcus Dean stood at the front of the room, a thick binder tucked under his arm, his voice calm but laced with urgency. What happened to Amira didn't happen in isolation, he said. It's part of a pattern, a system, and if we want real change, we need to hit them where they can't ignore it inside a court of law. The idea of a class action lawsuit didn't just land, it exploded. Word spread like wildfire. Victims came forward in droves, their stories pouring into Marcus's office faster than he could process them. Local civil rights attorneys, usually working isolated battles, joined forces for the first time in years. Volunteers set up mobile legal clinics in churches, in barbershops, even in grocery store parking lots. People lined up for blocks, ready to sign affidavits, to add their names to the cause. Within 2 weeks, they had more than 300 plaintiffs. And standing at the head of all was Amira. When Marcus first asked her to be the lead plaintiff, she hesitated, not because she doubted the cause, but because she understood what it meant. It would mean more interviews, more scrutiny, more threats from those who didn't want change. It would mean giving up any hope of quietly returning to her old life. But when she thought of the stories she had heard, when she pictured the faces of the people too beaten down to stand up for themselves, her hesitation vanished. She agreed. The night they filed the lawsuit was clear and humid, the stars blurred by the thick Florida air. Amira stood on the courthouse steps, flanked by Marcus Dean, Major Lewis, and a dozen other plaintiffs. Cameras rolled, microphones pushed forward. Reporters jostled for space. Marcus spoke first, reading a brief statement about systemic abuse, the failure of internal accountability, and the urgent need for structural reform. Then he stepped aside, and Amira moved forward. She didn't read from a script. She spoke from her heart. "We are not here today because we seek vengeance," she said, her voice carrying through the night. "We are here because we seek truth, because we believe that dignity is not something that should be requested, but something that must be respected. Because we know that until the system changes, none of us are truly safe." A pause. A breath. And because we understand that real justice is not just about punishment. It's about transformation. The next morning, every major news outlet in America carried the story. Jacksonville police facing historic class action civil rights lawsuit. Amira Lewis leads hundreds in battle against systemic abuse. From victim to vanguard, the rise of a reluctant hero. Inside the Jacksonville city government, panic set in. Emergency meetings were called behind closed doors. Lawyers were hired at astronomical hourly rates. Press releases were issued, full of hollow denials and vague promises to do better. But it was too late. The dam had broken, and no amount of public relations spin could patch it back together. The lawsuit detailed horrors that even seasoned journalists found hard to read without flinching. Incidents stretching back over a decade. Beatings, false arrests, intimidation tactics, evidence tampering. Cases where internal affairs investigations were closed within hours without interviewing a single witness. Officers promoted after repeated complaints. Citizens blacklisted for daring to file grievances. Every ugly, damning piece of it was laid bare in black and white filings for the world to see, and Amira's name was on the very first page. As the case gained steam, national civil rights organizations joined in, offering legal support, investigative teams, media liaisons. Donations poured in to fund the battle. Crowdfunding campaigns smashed their goals in hours. Anonymous donors, celebrities, everyday citizens all pitching in to keep the fight alive. In Jacksonville itself, the city split wide open. Some clung desperately to the old ways, to the myth that there were only a few bad apples. But more and more residents saw the rot for what it was: not isolated incidents, but a deeply entrenched sickness that infected the roots. Marches continued, but now they were organized around court dates, around discovery deadlines, around depositions. The movement had matured. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was focused pressure, strategic and relentless. Amira became a symbol, but she never allowed herself to become just a face on a poster. She attended every hearing she could, even when it meant facing sneers from the defense attorneys or cold stares from police union representatives. She spoke at town halls, not in anger but in determined clarity, outlining demands for reform, real civilian oversight, body camera mandates, independent investigations into police misconduct, reparations for victims. Everywhere she went, she carried herself with the same quiet dignity she had shown that night inside the fluorescent hell of the holding cell. And behind her, the movement grew. Across the country, other cities began launching their own investigations. Other victims found the courage to step forward. Other lawsuits were filed. Jacksonville was no longer alone. It was the epicenter of a nationwide reckoning. But Amira never lost sight of where it all began, not in the crowds, not in the cameras, not in the courtrooms. It had begun in the small, bitter, humiliated silence of that cell. In the decision to sit still, to endure, to become steel under pressure. As the first pretrial motions were argued before a packed federal courtroom, as the city's lawyers scrambled to delay, deflect, deny, Amira sat in the front row, calm, focused, unshakable. Because this wasn't just about winning a lawsuit, it was about changing the story. Changing what was considered normal. Changing what would be tolerated. And no matter how long it took, no matter how many battles they still had to fight, Amira Lewis knew this. They were never going back. The old world had cracked open. And through the fractures, something stronger, something truer, was finally taking root. But just when the momentum seemed to settle into a steady march, the courtroom doors opened and history rushed in. Jacksonville had braced itself for the trial, but no one, not even the seasoned politicians clinging to the last shreds of the old system, was prepared for what was about to unfold. It began with jury selection. Lawyers on both sides fought tooth and nail over every seat, every potential juror, understanding that was not just a trial. It was a referendum on decades of silence, on every whispered, "That's just the way things are," that had protected the powerful and punished the vulnerable. After 3 grueling days, the jury was seated 6 women, 6 men, diverse in age and race, but united by something deeper, something the defense attorneys failed to understand. An unspoken hunger for truth. Opening arguments set the tone. Marcus Dean, commanding but never theatrical, spoke plainly. This case is not just about a wrongful arrest. It's about a culture system that chose intimidation over service, brutality over protection, silence over accountability. Across the aisle, the defense blustered about difficult jobs and misunderstandings. But the words rang hollow against the mountain of evidence that Marcus and his team had painstakingly assembled. Witness after witness took the stand. Some cried, some trembled. Some spoke with the cold precision of people who had relived their trauma too many times to show emotion anymore. Bodycam footage flickered across giant screens. Amira's calm dignity as officers manhandled her, the blank-eyed indifference of Whitaker as he barked orders, the smirk of Monroe as he clicked handcuffs closed around wrists that had done nothing but demand respect. Amira testified on the 4th day. The courtroom held its breath as she walked to the stand, her every step deliberate, her every movement a reclamation of the space that had once tried to crush her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't weep. She simply told the truth, the long, humiliating night in the cell, the way they had ignored her documentation, the way they had treated her body like an inconvenience to be disposed of, not a person to be protected. Her testimony rippled outward, cutting through the courtroom's stale air, through the reporters' click-clacking keyboards, through the hardened faces of officers lined up in silent solidarity for their fallen comrades. No spin, no manufactured outrage, no performative tears could erase what everyone could now see clearly. The prosecution closed with a devastating summary of systemic rot, connecting each abusive act, not as an isolated mistake, but as a predictable result of a culture deliberately built to shield itself from scrutiny. This wasn't about one bad day, Marcus said, his voice steady. This was about a system that believed it was untouchable. The defense tried to counter with appeals to fear crime statistics, tough neighborhoods, vague insinuations that chaos would reign without strong policing. But the images on the screens, the faces of the plaintiffs, the calm resolve of Amira standing tall, those were stronger than any scare tactics. Deliberations took less than a day. When the jury returned, the courtroom tensed, as if the very walls themselves were holding their breath. The foreman, a graying middle-aged teacher, rose, verdict slip trembling slightly in his hand. On the charges of false imprisonment, guilty. On the charges of abuse of power, guilty. On the charges of civil rights violations, guilty. On the charges of conspiracy to cover up misconduct, guilty. Each word landed like a hammer blow, shattering the old myths one by one. Whitaker's face turned ashen. Monroe slumped in his chair. Several officers in the audience simply lowered their heads, unable to watch the unraveling of a system they thought would protect them forever. The judge, a stern woman who had shown no emotion throughout the proceedings, spoke next, her voice slicing through the stunned silence. Effective immediately, Officers Whitaker and Monroe are stripped of their badges, pending sentencing. Furthermore, this court recommends federal review of departmental practices and oversight of city leadership. The ripple effect was immediate and brutal. Within 48 hours, the police chief resigned under a cloud of damning emails and phone records. 3 senior commanders followed, either resigning quietly or facing internal investigations that made their positions untenable. The mayor, who had initially dragged his feet on acknowledging systemic problems, announced he would not seek re-election, citing a desire to focus on family, though no one believed it. The city itself began to change. Federal monitors were installed within the police department. A civilian review board, with real power to investigate and discipline officers, was created and staffed, not by political appointees, but by citizens, teachers, nurses, pastors, veterans. Mandatory de-escalation training and racial bias education became requirements for all law enforcement officers, old and new. Body cameras were not just required, they were monitored by an independent agency with full authority to release footage in cases of misconduct. Even beyond the courtroom, the spirit of accountability surged. Schools added new curriculums about civic rights. Local businesses sponsored scholarships for minority students. Churches held weekly town halls not just for prayer, but for action, organizing food drives, legal aid sessions, and voter registration campaigns. It wasn't perfect. There were still whispers of resistance, still dark corners clinging to the old ways. But the balance had shifted, and this time, the people refused to let it shift back. Amira stood quietly at the center of it all, never asking for attention but never shrinking from her role either. When asked by a reporter how she felt after the verdict, she paused for a long moment before answering. "Tired," she said simply, "but proud. Not just proud of myself. Proud of everyone who stood up, who refused to stay silent, who demanded better." Major Lewis, standing nearby, gave her a quiet, approving nod. He had always known she had this strength inside her. Now, the world knew too. A week after the verdict, Jacksonville held a rally, not a protest, but a celebration. Hemming Plaza, once the site of tense standoffs, was transformed into a festival of hope. There were food trucks, live music, poetry readings. Children painted murals honoring civil rights leaders past and present. A giant canvas banner stretched across City Hall, reading simply, "We are the change." Amira walked through the plaza that afternoon, her steps slow, savoring the moment. Strangers stopped her, shaking her hand, hugging her, thanking her. Parents lifted their children so they could see her, whispering lessons about bravery and dignity. She took none of it for granted. Every smile, every tearful thank you, every chant of "Amira, Amira," was a reminder of how much had been risked and how much more there was still to do. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of gold and deep purple, Amira stood on a small stage, microphone in hand. She didn't prepare a speech. She didn't need one. She spoke from the place that had carried her this far, the deep, unbreakable core of a woman who had once sat in a cold cell and refused to bow. "We won a battle," she said, her voice firm but warm. "But justice isn't a destination, it's a journey. And tonight, we take the next step together." The crowd roared its approval, but Amira didn't linger in the noise. She stepped down, blending back into the sea of faces she had fought for. She didn't need the spotlight. She didn't need the headlines. She had something better. She had her dignity. She had her community. And she had a future where no one would ever again doubt the power of one voice standing firm against a storm. Because Amira Lewis had proven something undeniable. When truth refuses to bow, even the strongest walls must fall, and fall they did. But just when the bright light of victory seemed to settle gently over Jacksonville, Amira realized that her journey wasn't about one courtroom, one city, or even one case. It was about something far larger, something she had only glimpsed before but could now feel growing with every heartbeat, a movement that stretched beyond herself, beyond any single injustice, a movement built on the courage to stand up when standing was hardest. Weeks after the celebrations, when the news crews had packed up and the headlines had begun to fade, Amira sat alone on the worn steps of her small house. The neighborhood was quiet, cicadas buzzing lazily in the thick summer air. She sipped from a chipped mug of tea, the taste bittersweet, and thought about everything that had happened. Not just the arrests and the verdicts, but the faces, the teenage boy who had thanked her with tears in his eyes, the grandmother who had squeezed her hand at the rally, the countless strangers who had marched not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. At first, she had believed that winning the lawsuit would be the end of the story. That once the guilty were punished, once new policies were signed into law, she could finally rest. But the more she listened, the more she learned. The clearer it became. Victory wasn't an endpoint. It was a beginning. Justice wasn't a trophy you placed on a shelf. It was a fire you had to tend, day after day, choice after choice. She saw it in the eyes of the young activists who now flooded Jacksonville's community centers, organizing voter drives, teaching Know Your Rights workshops, challenging outdated ordinances. She saw it in the teachers revising their history curriculums, ensuring that stories like hers and so many others were no longer erased. She saw it in the quiet dignity of her neighbors, walking a little taller, smiling a little wider, believing just a little more fiercely that change wasn't impossible. Amira hadn't meant to become a symbol. She had only meant to survive that night in the pharmacy with her dignity intact. But survival had blossomed into something bigger. A refusal to be invisible. A refusal to accept that cruelty was normal. A stubborn, radiant belief that simply standing up could change the ground itself. One evening, Marcus Dean stopped by, papers tucked under his arm, a tired but hopeful smile on his face. They sat together under the stars, talking about the next lawsuits being filed, the next reforms being demanded, the next cities where people had finally decided they wouldn't wait any longer. As he left, he turned back and said, almost casually, "You know, it's not just about winning cases. It's about giving people permission to believe they matter." Amira nodded, the truth of it settling deep in her bones. Later, she found herself invited to speak at universities, at churches, even before congressional subcommittees. Each time, she told the same story, not of one heroic moment, but of all the tiny, painful, stubborn decisions that added up to it. To stay calm when they shoved her, to speak when they expected her to cower, to endure when they tried to erase her, and to rise again and again, even when the world made it as hard as possible. At a community center one afternoon, a little girl barely taller than the podium asked Amira, "Were you scared?" Amira crouched down to meet her eyes. "Yes," she said. "I was scared. But being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing, even when you are." The girl nodded solemnly, clutching her notebook a little tighter. That was the legacy Amira hoped to leave. Not fame, not statues, but seeds. Seeds of courage planted in every heart that heard her story. In the months that followed, Jacksonville continued to change. Not perfectly, not easily, but undeniably. Officer complaints were no longer buried. Body cam footage was released promptly. Town halls buzzed with real debate, real accountability. The old guard, those who had ruled with fear and silence, faded into irrelevance. And in their place rose a new generation, shaped by the memory of a woman who had once sat in a cold cell and refused to be broken. One evening, on the anniversary of her arrest, the city organized a candlelight vigil. Not a protest, not even a celebration. Something quieter, more profound. Thousands gathered in Hemming Plaza, their candles flickering against the night. No speeches were made, no banners were waved. Just light, stretching out across the darkness, each tiny flame a testament to the power of one voice refusing to be silenced. Amira stood among them, anonymous, her candle held high. She didn't need the spotlight. She didn't need the credit. She needed only this: to know that even when she was gone, even when her name was a footnote in history books, the fire she helped spark would still be burning in 1,000 hearts she would never meet. That night, as she walked home, the warm breeze carrying the scent of jasmine and something sweeter still hope, Amira smiled to herself. She thought back to the woman she had been that night at the pharmacy, tired, humiliated, hurting. She thought back to the first terrifying moments in the back of that squad car, the first heavy clang of the jail door. She had been afraid. She had been angry. But she had also been right. Dignity wasn't something anyone could take away from you. Justice wasn't something anyone could hand you. You had to stand for it. You had to live it. Amira knew the work would never be finished. There would always be another battle, another voice to lift, another injustice to confront. But she also knew something even more important, something that had carried her from that small holding cell all the way to this brighter tomorrow. Real change didn't start with masses. It started with one person deciding that enough was enough. One person refusing to sit down. One person daring to believe they could make a difference. And once that fire was lit, it could never be extinguished. Not by fear. Not by hatred. Not even by time. Because courage, once awakened, moves forward forever. Just like Amira Lewis had. Amira Lewis didn't set out to change the world. She simply refused to let the world change who she was. In the face of humiliation, she chose dignity. In the face of injustice, she chose to stand. And through that quiet, unwavering courage, she lit a fire that reached far beyond herself. A fire that still burns in every heart brave enough to believe that change is possible. Her story reminds us that true strength isn't about grand gestures or loud victories. It's found in the small, stubborn acts of standing firm when no one is watching, in the choice to be seen even when it's easier to disappear. Today, Jacksonville is different. Not perfect, but better. And it all began with one woman who decided she would not be silenced. Maybe the most powerful lesson Amira leaves us is this. You don't have to be fearless to be a force for change. You just have to stand up once and refuse to back down. If Amira's story moved you, if it reminded you that even the smallest voice can shape the future, please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and hit subscribe to join us. Because here, we tell the stories that prove one act of courage can echo through generations, and we're just getting started.